From New York, Democrats are reportedly at work right now on a campaign strategy to push back against a growing element of the Republican Tea Party agenda, an agenda even Republicans know is so unpopular they do not want you to know about it. It is, in our fifth story tonight, class warfare, a war against the middle class and the working poor. Namely, the Republican position that Americans are not working enough and they're not poor enough. Alaska Senate Republican Tea Party candidate Joe Miller is only the most noteworthy attacker today in a web interview with ABC News and Politico, reading the Constitution literally to declare the federal minimum wage unconstitutional because it's not in there. And the 10th Amendment, which he does not read literally, prohibits, in his mind, any federal program or power not identified by name in the Constitution. But even if it were constitutional to require that Americans make at least $7.25 an hour, the current minimum wage, Miller says it's still a bad idea.
That should be the state's decision.
So there should not be a federal minimum wage?
There should not be. That is not within the scope of the powers that are given to the federal government. And again, let me make it clear, this is not just a simple checklist. This is, let's think of this pragmatically as well. Even if you disagree with the constitutional approach, which I think is the #1 thing that we ought to be following, it still makes far more sense to have those kind of decisions made at the level closest to the people, where there's more accountability, less inefficiency, where there's a more understanding of where the people ought to be and what the state role of government is. We've said this many times. If you like big government, move to Massachusetts.
In fact, the Supreme Court unanimously upheld the minimum wage's constitutionality in 1941 in a battle that also involved the constitutionality of child labor laws, which also do not appear in the Constitution. Miller's law school, Yale, not responding today to our question whether anyone there teaches that the minimum wage is unconstitutional. The National Journal today reports that Democrats are planning to use the minimum wage issue not only against Miller, but against a surprisingly large number of Republicans who are also challenging it. Just last week, Connecticut Senate candidate Linda McMahon called for a review of the minimum wage and did not know what her own state's minimum wage was. West Virginia Senate candidate John Race has called, like Miller, for simply eliminating the minimum wage. Washington Senate candidate Dino Rossi has supported lower wages for teenagers and called for freezing the minimum wage for grown-ups. Illinois gubernatorial candidate Bill Brady wants to lower his state's minimum wage. Minnesota gubernatorial candidate Tom Emmer argued this summer that waiters make too much money, $100,000 a year, he said, thanks to the tips they get. So he wants to cut the minimum wage for anyone who makes tips. The median wage for waiters there is, in fact, $9.36 an hour, $19,000 a year. Chris Dudley also has a problem with waitresses. The Oregon gubernatorial candidate made headlines last month when he said it doesn't make sense that our waitresses are getting tips plus the highest minimum wage in the country. How high is the Oregon minimum wage Dudley has a problem with? $8.50 an hour. The website Blue Oregon reporting this means an average salary of $35,000 to $50,000, well below the $450,000 that is the minimum wage for Dudley's old job in the NBA. Why haven't you heard about this from Republicans? Ask Dudley.
I'm not going to make a forefront campaign issue out of it because I think it's something that's a hot button that people don't really understand. But at some point, I'm well aware of the issue.
That's a rich former pro athlete explaining how he's going to keep everybody else poor. But working for lower wages is not all that working Americans must do in Tea Party America. Minimum wage workers must work longer until they are older and retire on less. That, Kentucky Senate candidate Rand Paul explains, is how they'll pay for extending tax cuts for those making more than $250,000 a year.
Well, I think you don't do anything to people who are currently receiving Medicare or Social Security, but we do have to admit that we have the baby boom generation getting ready to retire, and we're going to double the amount of retirees. And to put our head in the sand and just say we're going to keep borrowing more money is not going to work. There will have to be changes for the younger generation.
So be specific.
For the younger generation, there will have to changes in eligibility, and they've already started talking about this.
So you would raise the retirement age?
There may have to be for younger people, yes. For younger people, longevity is out there. I mean, the average life expectancy in the 30s was 65.
You've also talked about higher deductibles or higher premiums.
Not for those who are currently on Medicare or Social Security.
55 or younger.
Yes, you're going to have eligibility changes for the younger people. And I think all younger people, if they're honest and will admit to it and have an adult discussion and not demagogue the issue, will admit that younger people will have to have different rules.
Okay.
Okay, let's bring in Rachel Maddow, host of The Rachel Maddow Show, every weeknight here on MSNBC. Rachel, good evening.
Good evening, Keith. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. How real is this Republican antipathy toward the minimum wage, and what on earth could be behind it? How could it sell?
In looking into this today, knowing that you were going to be leading with this and we were going to be able to talk to it, I ended up going through my own files on the minimum wage, and I was surprised to sort of find there all the stuff about ACORN. Remember all the Republican hysteria about ACORN when it went from being sort of a corporate and conservative movement, anti-ACORN thing, and then it blew up and all the Republicans really started piling on against them? The thing that ACORN was really, really good at was advocating for a living wage. Not only making sure that there was a minimum wage that was enforced everywhere, but that when you made minimum wage, it was a minimum wage that allowed you to live out of poverty, that allowed you to live in a way that had some dignity. If you worked full-time, you ought to not be poor in the United States. ACORN was great at that because the minimum wage and a living wage is very popular every time you put it on the ballot somewhere. That freaked out the right. And it started off with the corporations trying to unseat them, and they eventually got the Republicans across the board to pile onto them. That was the real threat that ACORN ever, I think, posed to conservatives and to the Republicans that support them. And I think that's why they had to go after them so vociferously.
My head hurts.
Yeah.
But how can you sell this? I mean, at any point, is a Democrat going to make it clear that the Tea Partiers are appealing to middle class and lower middle class and working poor who may feel overtaxed and have some sort of natural affinity to those sort of candidates, the guy with the 5 o'clock shadow in Alaska, that in fact these people are not only out to wage class warfare on them, but actually seem intent on making sure that they shoot any survivors who might somehow slip through the cracks?
Yeah, at this point, the Democratic challenge is to turn policy here into politics, because the reason all of these Republican candidates feel like they can say stuff this radical is because they think they're only talking to their base. They think they are talking about issues that only they will engage on, that there's no Democratic counter-argument, that there's no way to seem too extreme from the right, that if you can it's all about mobilizing the conservative movement base, and there's no cost to pay. There's no electoral price to pay for being very, very radical on these issues. Democrats, when they try to call Republicans out on these, find very soft targets. It's very easy to make an attack ad out of Rand Paul's position on what it is to not be an ophthalmologist in this country. And people who try to do it have great success with those ads. It's just a matter of Democrats actually being willing to swing at those very soft targets.
All right, well then let's try this on Joe Miller's argument. Can you unpack this thing about constitutionality regarding this and Social Security and, you know, pretty much everything that is considered the social safety net in this country? What is his argument?
Well, he's a tenther. He's, you know, we had birthers, we had deathers. He's a tenther. He's a person who has a radical fringe interpretation of what the 10th Amendment means. And so he not only thinks that there ought not be a minimum wage, that that's against the Constitution, but that the government, whether or not it's a good idea, literally cannot have programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. There can't be any unemployment insurance. Joe Miller is one of these candidates who won't engage with non-conservative media. They won't, for example, his campaign won't make him available to my show or your show to do an interview. I know that we've asked many, many times with him. I would love for somebody who doesn't already agree with him and want him to win that election to be able to ask him questions, because I suspect that if you asked him whether it is constitutional for there to be an income tax, we might find out that Joe Miller's a lot like Wesley Snipes. I think if somebody asked him if it's constitutional for there to be a Civil Rights Act that prohibits businesses from refusing to serve black patrons, for example, we might find out that he's a lot like Rand Paul. As long as he stays, though, in his right-wing media bubble, nobody's asking him those questions.
The argument that states know best, too, is appealing to anybody who actually never took a course in American history or not recently. What is the reality of the society they want to bring about, or should we actually say bring back? Is this let's kick out all the migrants and the immigrants so that we can put Americans back in those jobs, you know, picking tomatoes and such? Or what's the ultimate end of this?
Well, I mean, it's an argument that has a lot of very overt historical precedent. It's a very Civil War-like argument. If the federal government does not have the power to set minimum rules for things under the interstate commerce powers that are declared in the Constitution, then the federal government can't say, hey, Deep South state, you have to pay people for working for you, for example. I mean, when you have a radical proposition on states' rights, like tenthers do, like, for example, Joe Miller does, the slippery slope is very slippery and very steep.